Hello and welcome as we come now to the fifth week of regular time. We pick up in a certain way. You remember that last week, particularly those of our Catholic tradition, celebrated the feast of the presentation of the Lord in the temple, so the regular reading for that weekend was not used by our tradition, although certainly, as I indicated last time, there was a series of readings. So here we are this time. The first reading comes from the book of the prophet Isaiah, chapter 6, verses 1 through 2a, and verses 3 through 8. The second reading is from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 15, verses 1 through 11, and then the Gospel of Luke, chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. So there's 2 1s, so it was 11 kind of things. All right. Now, in many cases, as we've noticed, and we're looking at the Gospel tradition according to Luke, follows the pattern that it was placed into perspective by Mark and picked up by Matthew, and often Luke follows what Mark has done. But in this case, he makes a difference or a distinction, where in Matthew and Mark, Jesus chooses 4 men, Matthew, Peter and Andrew, James and John, fishermen, to be part of his entourage. In this case, that has not happened. In Luke's story, Jesus is pictured as, in the opening chapters of his work, doing his mission by himself. He engages in teaching of some kind. He engages, as we have seen, he tells parables. He engages in healing, but it seems to be a ministry that he does by himself. And so, in the gospel that we hear this time, story, we picture Jesus now as being, again, at the Sea of Gennesareth, or the Sea of Galilee, or the Sea of Tiberias. Same body of water, goes by different names, often determined by who the gospel writer is. And I have to smile because even those who determine the size of this lake, which they call a sea, have various interpretations. One author says that it was 13 miles long and 7 miles across at its widest point. Other writer says it was 14 miles long and 8 miles across at its widest point. So take your choice, okay? Now, that would be in Jesus or first century time. The size, or the shape rather, of the lake or river, not river, but of sea, is like that of a harp. And that seems to be where it got its name, Kinneret, Kinneret. And as we have mentioned on other occasions, over the years, as we move into the 21st century, the size of the sea is diminished, mainly because the amount of water being poured into the Sea of Galilee is minimal, or is less, because it is being diverted by other factions into other directions. Therefore, the amount of water to come in is reduced, and in fact, places that used to be on the coast of the Sea of Galilee today are dry land, and the sea is, or the city or town or village is considered now to be inland, only because over a period of time with no water, the ground has become part of the story again. So all of that's a little bit of of a background to where Jesus is pictured as teaching. Now, the story is that he is, again, and near, perhaps we suspect, Capernaum, which, as you remember, turns out to be the kind of center place where Jesus is often teaching, comes to where Peter and his companions named James and John, who's interestingly not mentioned in the scenario or gospel that we're going to hear this time, Andrew, who is the brother rather of Peter. Now, we have also noticed, on another occasion, even shown pictures and talked about this, that in the year 1986, a few years ago now, because the water level of the Sea of Galilee was going down, unearthed a boat that had been sunk into the ground, and obviously over the years had been covered over, but now with the lack of water, it emerged. And this, of course, is the famous, well, since we always want to make sure it's named after someone we know, is called Peter's boat. What they discover is putting it together. It has been unearthed, dried out, and now reconstructed and is in the foyer of one of the hotels in Israel today that you can see. I think on other occasions we have shown what that is. The boat is 26 feet long, 7.5 feet wide, and 4 and 5 feet high. So it gives us a sense of what a boat used in those days would have been like. Now, the dating of the boat is interesting, depending on, of course, we like to interpret it as first century time, but it could have been a boat built any time from the year 140 before the Common Time to about the year 40 of the Common Era. So it might have been a boat that was used by Peter and his friends. We don't know, but at least it gives us a kind of indication of what the boat is like. All right. Now, along comes Jesus, and he says to Peter, "Can I use your boat?" It's for the sake of teaching. And therefore he gets in Peter's boat, so they push off a little bit to the shore. The people are pictured as standing on the shore, listening to what Jesus has to say. We have enumerated on other occasions the reason why that would have worked quite well is because the water would have allowed the voice of Jesus to be heard by those who are on the shore. Kind of standing in that situation. Picture it a little bit the way in which the Greeks developed their own theater by having a central character and then people sitting around it, so that the sound kind of was heard, reverberated, or the voice was heard by many surrounding it. So all of that a little bit indicates what Jesus does. Now he gets into Peter's boat. Now the question might be, well, why would Peter suddenly let this strange man use his boat? Even though perhaps the popularity of Jesus was well known. But we also suspect, remember, that in this story, Jesus had gone to the house of Peter and Andrew and had cured Peter's mother-in-law who was ill. So therefore, now we're not sure whether Peter was there when Jesus healed his mother-in-law. We assume he was, but we're not sure. The gospel is quiet about that. But what it does suggest is that Peter was, well, I know who this guy is, and maybe the old idea of a chip, you do something for me, in turn, you do something for me, may have been behind it. We don't know. I just smile at that. But if he had healed his mother-in-law, I have to be careful about what your thought about mother-in-laws are. But having healed her, he now responds to Jesus' request that he uses his boat. All right, we're not sure what Jesus taught as he was doing this, but when he is finished with his teaching, he says to Peter and Peter and James and John. Now, we get the indication in this story that there are two boats. We don't know whether there were others, as we will hear in a moment. What they are doing is mending their nets, which means that they have been out fishing, are finished with whatever they have done. Jesus says to Peter, well, how are things going? Well, we fished all night and we caught nothing. I see. Well, now Jesus says, go out into the deep and throw your nets in for a catch. Now this story, which is going to be the story of a tremendous catch on the part of the disciples at this point, is similar to one. In this case, this is the only story, this miraculous big catch, is only taught in the synoptic tradition by Luke, not by Matthew and Mark. But in the gospel tradition according to John, in chapter 21, the end of the Johannine gospel, is a similar account, where there is this, well, we call it miraculous catch of fish. And interpreters of John's gospel see it as a resurrection story. After all, chapter 21 is the last chapter of John's story. So the question that scholars kind of wrestle with is, which of these accounts is in the right place and which happened first? Or were there two separate accounts, one used by the Johannine writer and one by Luke? That again is one that comes under discussion, and so we don't have an immediate answer to this. Peter says to Jesus, when he says, go out and cast your net into the deep, Master, we have fished all night and have caught nothing. Now it's interesting that Jesus tells Peter to put out into the deep and let down for a catch. Peter is seems to be correcting Jesus. Look, he says, we fished all night and we caught nothing. Why would we do it again? But, and here is where Peter now makes certainly what we would consider to be an act of faith, does what Jesus has said. Now how far the deep is in the Sea of Galilee, and that's why I gave the size a little bit, but it does go down quite a bit. And apparently, I'm not a great expert on water levels, but there is a different type of water that comes to the surface and that at a certain point underneath changes. And so those of you who are experts in this can kind of check this out. As we have mentioned before, the Galilee itself is below sea level, and so the water here would be warmer, but nevertheless there were levels, and that affected the amount of salt that would be found in the water. Anyway, they lower their nets. They get this huge catch, so much so that they have to bring the other boat in. They fill up their nets, and then there's reference to other boats also. Now, we're not sure if there were other boats, how many there were, but the idea is that the boats are filled with fish almost to the point of sinking. So this is certainly a marvelous catch. We're not sure what the number is. There's no counting. Counting the number of fish was something that the Johannine Gospel I mentioned earlier on, when it tells this story, indicates, but here simply a large number. Now, keep in mind here that Peter and James and John are in business. So fishing is a big business, certainly then, as well I suspect it might be now. And the fact that they get this tremendous catch of fish is a wonderful addition to their income. Think about it. All of this fish now will mean that they, well, they'll still have to work, but that they will certainly have enough to feed and to take care of things for a while. Often, by the way, some of the fish was fresh and used right away, but others was smoked and then saved and sold, and that, of course, became a profitable business for those who were engaged in the business of fishing. Now, Peter, when he sees what has happened, falls at the knees of Jesus and says that he is a sinner, and gives, if you want, praise to Jesus. So that's an important thing to notice. Now, at this point, Jesus says to Peter, well, will you come and follow me? All right, and we assume that James and John also did. Notice that the emphasis here in Luke's account is on the person of Peter. And perhaps it's important to notice in the third gospel in Luke's story, Peter is one of the more favorable and major players in the story and ministry of Jesus. We have noticed before, and I just want to reintroduce this, that in the work of Luke, namely Gospel Acts, remember that those two are connected together, he builds his story around three important heroes or figures, namely Jesus, Peter, and Paul. So there's a certain sequence, and what happens here is that Peter gets a call. So it's not, and that whole pattern of the, what we call call story, we have noticed before. And Jesus, of course, we have seen earlier in this gospel, was called by God. After his baptism, the Spirit came down upon him. This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased. All right, so we know the story that figures Jesus as the divinely appointed prophet and Savior of God. So now we get the call of Peter. So it follows a certain pattern. He is invited to do something. Jesus says, cast your net put out into the deep and cast your net into the water. Then there's a certain reaction to it by the part of the person who is asked to do something. One might remember the call perhaps of Mary back in chapter 2 of Luke's gospel. You are to be the mother of God. Well, how can I know this when I have had no relations with man? All right, what does Peter say? Look, we have done this before and it has not worked. So Peter kind of, well, does he correct Jesus or does he challenge Jesus or whatever you want? But the reaction is typical. The invitation is given. There's a response on the part to whom the message is given that is usually a questioning, and Jesus is questioned here by Peter. But he does it anyway, and so you get this huge capture of fish. And that, if you want, the call of Peter to be a follower of Jesus is positively done when Jesus says, and as an aside, James and John, come follow me, and I will make you fishers of people, fishers of men. So they are to trade industries, if they want, from where they were fishing for, well, fish, to now working to bring men and women into the fold of the gospel. The invitation is given also to at this point where Jesus says to them, "Do not be afraid." All right. So what happens? And do not be afraid. What? To change professions here. Now think about it. What Peter and James and John and perhaps others are being asked to do is to leave behind a marvelous treasure that they have just received, this tremendous amount of fish. Think about it, and what it could do for them and how it could benefit themselves and their families. And so when Jesus says, "Come, follow me," they literally have to leave behind certainly valuable possessions and goods. And again, a characteristic of the third gospel is this concern on the part of the gospel writer in his picture of Jesus about worldly possessions and how one is attached to them. And so, again, keep in mind, this newly discovered riches they have are being left behind to follow Jesus. And to follow Jesus doesn't mean that life is going to be easy. One is reminded again of the Simeon's remark to Mary when Jesus was presented in the temple, "This child is destined for the rise and fall of many, and that there will be lots of hardships and setbacks." And that is really, if one thinks about it, whether they truly appreciated what they were getting into, is what the followers in following Jesus rather now will entail on the part of Peter and the disciples. So in a certain way, Peter's response is his full confession of Jesus as the Lord. And so being now from fishermen to fishers of people is the new role in which he is being called. Now, I do point out that the message of Jesus here essentially is geared toward Peter, and Peter's has done this already, if you think about it, just to back up a moment, has sharing his possessions with his business partners is a subtle anticipation that later in the Jerusalem community, that's what they do. Now, I've often pointed out that you need to keep the connection between the gospel and the Acts in mind as we're looking through this year at that relationship. In the end of chapter 2 and the end of chapter 4 of the Acts of the Apostles, one finds that the new community of believers who are centered in Jerusalem share with one another all that they possess, and that those who are in need of something are helped by those who have. And so the idyllic picture developed early in the Acts of the Apostles is this idea of sharing the possessions that they have with the needy and with one another. So already you can see here, and Peter is pictured as kind of being the advocate of those things, that way of thinking rather in the Acts of the Apostles. So notice here, the beginning, the linking of Peter with the ministry of Jesus, but also in exercising the role of leadership once Jesus is raised from the dead. So although the focus certainly throughout the gospel remains on Jesus, keep in mind that Peter is kind of always present in the shadows. He will turn out, as he does in the other Gospels, when push comes to pull, to reject Jesus, but then also accepts his forgiveness. So all of that kind of is background to this story, all right? So the call, and that's what I'm wanting to say here, that this story, the second part of it, has to do with the call of Peter, not simply to be a disciple, but also, as it becomes evident, the leader of the community once Jesus has suffered, died, and been raised. So Luke, of course, knows the whole event, that he's kind of telling this from his point of view. All right, so all of that is one way to look at the story that we hear this time, where Jesus does, as I say, choose these early disciples. In other places, of course, and Mark had developed this, is the close connection of the three, Peter, James, and John. Poor Andy does not seem to kind of get as much attention in this gospel, and that may well be why John picks that up, as we've noticed on other occasions, to put Andrew back into proper perspective. All right, quickly, the reading from Paul, the first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 15, is important because it gives those who have seen the risen Jesus. It is one of the earliest statements in the scriptural tradition of witnesses to the resurrected Jesus. So we may certainly have talked about that on occasion, but it is certainly an important kind of little section to be reminded of. The first reading coming from, again, the prophet Isaiah, chapter 6. Now, generally, interpreters of the Isaiah letter point out, or prophecy, point out that chapter 6 is really the opening part of his letter. And it pictures, don't you wonder, Isaiah is in the temple. Therefore, we suspect that somehow he is of a priestly line to begin with, that he is there. He is in the temple that had, been what was in place. This would have been probably around the year 742 before the common time, receives the call. So he's in the temple, and there's this smoke and this voice, and really you get a quite theatrical scene here. Those who like this kind of thing can see where all the kind of elements that appeal to the senses is presented. Who will I send? And Isaiah kind of, send me. And what do you get? You get clouds, okay, so the voice of God inside the temple now, keep in mind where this is taking place. You get fragrance. So you got to kind of use your imagination here, but you get incense and smoke and burning coals and all of the kind of, wow, what goes on here. And then you have the seraphim. Now, seraphim are usually included as one of the bands of angels. I don't know what you think of a seraphim looks like. I don't know either. But apparently in the temple is a seraphim, or the seraphims. And what are they doing? They are doing what the heavenly host like to do and always pictured as doing. They sing. And so what is the song they are singing? Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God. So get the orchestration of this scene as Isaiah is called to the role of prophecy. So sound, voice, smell, invitation, it all works in a grand way, doesn't it? Just the way it does when you come to church and pray. That suddenly you have, just kidding. All right. But it is a kind of with majesty and might that Isaiah is called to be the prophet that he is. And I think that's why this particular reading is chosen. The call of Isaiah, the call of Peter, and the beginning now of, well, for Jesus and his new disciples, not the beginning, but the continuing of his work. And for the first time in Luke, he uses others to help him in the message role, carrying out the call to join for what Luke will point out, the kingdom of God, which is not something to be discovered in the future, but is to be discovered now and in the present. Thank you for being with us, and hope to see you again.